Good morning or afternoon, everybody, and welcome to FSMA Fridays. And our topic for today, 1 month to go, what best-in-class companies are doing now to get ready for FSMA. I'm Barbara Levin with Safety Chain. I'll be your host today. Before we begin, let me give you a couple of housekeeping announcements. By Monday, all of you will receive the recording link. After we go through our pre-submitted questions today, we'll take your questions online. We'll tell you how to submit those in just a little bit when we're finished with our first questions. For your privacy, you can see the names of the panelists and the hosts and your name, but not the list of the other attendees. If you are having trouble hearing the audio through the speakers, you can go to the Event Info tab and you'll find dial-in information there. As always, we have a very simple agenda. We're going to start with pre-submitted questions on today's topic. We're going to give you a little bit of information about how Safety Chain can help you automate a FSMA-ready food safety plan, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I'm excited, as always, to welcome our FSMA Fridays team with Dr. David Atchison and Melanie Newman from the Atchison Group, and we'll be starting, as we always do, with David. So, David, welcome to another FSMA Friday. I never thought we would get to the point where we said 1 month to go, but before we start that, can we, maybe we can start with you and go to the latest updates on FSMA.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara, and it's great to be with you again and everybody else who's part of the FSMA Friday team. I think you're right, 1 month to go, like, wow. Well, we hope 1 month to go, and I certainly haven't heard anything on the grapevine that it's we got delays, we got hold-ups. I think I mentioned before there was even word that they may come out a little early, so maybe we'll get a mid-August gift for all of us, a little happy reading over summer. No, so I think we're all still on track, not heard anything on that. The biggest update was FDA did publish just recently, since last FSMA Friday, an updated component to the third-party audit rule, which, just to remind everybody, that is a rule that is focused on third-party auditors, whether they be in the public sector, foreign governments, individuals or private entities, in the context of what it takes to become effectively an FDA-accredited auditor, to audit companies primarily for the voluntary qualified importer program, and for companies that need to be compliant with any import inspection requirements that the FDA deems to put out there, which so far they haven't, which is not surprising because they don't have this whole component in place. To my way of reading that, no big surprises in there. There is still language in the reproposal which tells me it will wind up in the final, that if a food company has an audit through one of these programs, and that auditor finds a problem in that facility which could constitute a Class 1 or a Class 2 situation, then they are obligated to tell FDA. That was in the original proposed rule, and I think that a lot of people, including me, said, "Whoa, you know, that's pretty heavy duty," and wondered whether it would survive, and it has. It was very clearly in there in this reproposal. So this is going to be an interesting space to see where companies land. And I think one other comment that I'm hearing is, and I think we talked briefly last time about the voluntary qualified importer program coming out, which, again, to remind everybody, this is like the TSA pre for food. If you qualify for it, you get your products in the quick line without them having to take their shoes off. So it's the fast track through customs. And I've heard a number of people say to me, "Is this worth it? This is a heavy lift. We're going to have these accredited auditors in our foreign facilities. Do we really want to do it? Is it going to make a difference?" So I think there's going to be some interesting dynamics on that. But no, I think key bottom point line here is that maybe the next FSMA Friday we'll be talking about so what do those preventive control rules really say? So back to you, Barbara.
Oh, okay. Well, don't go away. We're going to stick with you here for question number 2. So going back to our topic today, you know, the Atchison Group, you know, you guys are leaders in working with companies, helping them get ready for FSMA. What are you seeing these best-in-class companies, what do you see them doing as they're approaching FSMA compliance preparations? How are they getting ready?
You know, I think what we're seeing probably more than anything, and Melanie has worked on this a lot with me also, and I'd certainly invite her to jump in on this question. We're seeing companies, first of all, number one is say, okay, which rules apply to me? Companies generally that we're working with know that they're going to need to be compliant with the preventive control rules, but then they're saying, well, where does the animal rule fit? Because we're sending some of our scraps off to animal feed. So there's definitely questions around exactly which rules am I going to need to pay attention to. So they're starting to ask those questions, and we're helping companies navigate that part. They're then largely saying, well, we already have good programs in place. We've already got HACCP plans and environmental monitoring programs, and do we need to recreate a whole new food safety plan binder that's got all this material laid out in a different way? And so we're working with companies to help them navigate that. And our view of that is, as we don't believe that you need to do that. We do believe that you need to create a narrative so that, let's just paint the scenario of what we expect when this rule is finally final, and 12 months down the road and you're a big company and the inspector comes in and says, okay, show me your food safety plan. Ask yourself, which is what we're working with our clients, what are you going to give them when they pose that question? Are you going to dump 15 binders on the table, which is a hodgepodge of different plans and prerequisite programs, and say, hey, it's all in here, go knock yourself out? To us, that's not the way to manage it. And what we're working with companies who we see as leading is developing a narrative, a program that does, my terminology, stitch this all together in a coherent way that is really laying out the basic fundamental steps of a food safety plan around potential hazards, significant hazards, preventive controls, which then all leads into the data and the information that supports that your preventive controls are validated, through to potential corrective actions and the monitoring, through to verification the program's working, the reanalysis and all the records that keep it together, linked in with your supplier controls, assuming that they wind up in the final, which I think they will, and the environmental monitoring, likewise, I think that will. So that's how leading companies are approaching FSMA compliance at this point. They've got a team working on it, and they're asking these questions of how do we take that down to the facility level. One final point on this is that with the advent of the requirement for supplier controls, many large companies control supply chain risk from a corporate base. The individual facilities aren't doing it. It's being driven out of a central unit, and the question will arise, well, the facilities themselves don't know a lot about the way we control the supply chains. And our view is that while you don't need to change your system, we do need to develop a process whereby when the qualified individual in the facility is asked by the inspector, show me your food safety plan, and oh, by the way, I want to see how you're controlling supply chain as part of FSMA requirements, that qualified individual needs to have a coherent answer and needs to be able to either access or direct the regulators to the source of the information real time. So that's another challenge that we're seeing here is programs that are controlled centrally that essentially need to be, I won't say available, but the qualified individual at the facility level is going to need to be able to respond to some of that. So let me just turn this question over to Melanie, because it's pretty broad too, in case any other insights that you may have, Melanie, to add to that.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for joining FSMA Friday. yeah, just to really build on David's point, it's really involving what story are you going to tell with regard to your food safety plan, and driving that down to the plant level quality assurance and quality control people. It really drives into question number 3 as well, and getting into what we see as some of the gaps. So Barbara, I don't mean to take the reins and march on to number 3, but I think it really does segue really well into some of the challenges, because that is one of the challenges that I think David and I really see when we're working with our clients, is how do you communicate and drive down that story, if you will, that narrative that David referred to with respect to, if you've got programs, policies and procedures that you're administering and creating at corporate, how do you get the message down to the facility level qualified individual, those people on the ground every day that are going to have to interact with those FDA inspectors, to educate them, to say, what are you going to tell? What are you going to show them? What narrative, what story about your food safety plan and program are you going to present? Whether that has to do with your supply chain verification controls that's going to be managed at corporate, or other types of policies and procedures that are typically managed at corporate. So I think that's actually one of the fundamental challenges that our clients right now are probably facing on a fundamental level.
Mm-hmm. So that is a good segue then. Let's use that to go to ask, you know, again, what are you folks at TAG seeing as some of the major gaps right now that are causing companies concern?
Well, since I brought it up, I'll be happy to take that one, Barbara. And I think that overall, from the work that we're doing and engaging with the industry, and I don't need to speak for David, but I think overall companies seem to have a pretty good grasp and foundation of the rules. So we call these the 7 pillars of FSMA, and I think from the threshold analysis of which rules apply to me that David referred to earlier, most companies have a pretty good grasp of which of the 7 rules apply to them, which ones don't. But from there, the details, the implementation details begin to get a little bit more fuzzy of how do I build and implement pragmatic programs that actually work in my unique facility. That's where we start to see a little bit more of a struggle past kind of that fundamental implementation stage. And where I see some major gaps, Barbara, is in systems and lack of documentation. And documentation can be a systematic problem in that you just don't have a system to house all of your documents, whatever kind of documents they may be. Or it can be more of a specific problem to particular topics like validation. Maybe you don't have particular process controls or preventive controls validated. So if you're in the nut industry and you're roasting nuts, if you don't have your roaster validated, come time of preventive controls rule for humans to be effective, you need to have that validated. So that's a documentation type of issue that becomes problematic that going forward we're going to need to have addressed. Calibration is another issue that kind of revolves around that documentation and systems type of gap that I'm seeing. And I know I've probably said it on several FSMA Fridays, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but I really mean to beat a dead horse when it comes to the following phrase. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And now we're moving into a regulatory landscape and era of there's going to be consequences if it's not documented, it didn't happen, and there's going to be a price to pay. So it really highlights the need and the opportunity to get some systems in place to manage the documentation and the record keeping around the FSMA expectations and regulations, because there's a lot you're expected to keep track of and to document and to record keep. And if you're keeping it in a filing cabinet or in a shoebox, you're not going to be able to manage it effectively when an inspector shows up on your doorstep and expects to have those records produced. Right.
Yeah. You have mentioned that, and I think it can't be said enough. Let's go back to David for a moment here. So given the gaps that we've seen, given the information that we've just discussed, how are you seeing companies approaching the building of that actual FSMA-compliant food safety plan?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. This gets back to a little bit of what I was saying earlier on, which was, I think, is a broader answer to that earlier question on approaches and what leading companies are doing. So it is looking at those critical components in a food safety plan, which I went over around the potential hazards, the significant hazards, et cetera, the preventive controls, the monitoring, corrective actions, et cetera. Looking at your other ancillary programs and looking at it through the lens of a HARP-C approach. So recognizing that your conventional HACCP plan isn't going to do it, well, at least it's going to do a lot, but it isn't going to be the whole food safety plan. And then adapting what we termed a tag HACCP to HARP-C is like, what does that look like? Moving from the fundamental HACCP principles, and none of that gets wasted. It just gets incorporated into the food safety plan. And I've been saying, Melanie's been saying, it's like developing this story, this narrative that one can present to the regulators without having to redo everything. I think what some companies haven't done perhaps is to document certain things that at least based on the proposed rules they're going to have to do in their food safety plan, such as the potential hazards. Is like, which hazards did you consider in your food safety plan, and then which ones and moved up to significant hazards. Sometimes the potential hazards are a little thin because, yeah, people thought of it, but they didn't write it down. And then building that up into the FSMA-compliant food safety plan. One tangential point on this, which gets to this hazard analysis component, is we're starting to hear from more than one source that the FDA is approaching this through a strategy to train their food inspectors to better understand the hazards that may be present in a company they're coming to inspect before they show up. This is a little bit different. Generally, an FDA inspector will arrive at a plant and submit their 482, and they show up and they do their inspection, and hopefully they leave without leaving either 483. But I think the way that the agency is trying to go is to understand that if you're going to go and inspect a plant making a certain set of products, the inspector will have either through training or through some internal database or through due diligence of his or her own, will go into that plant with a better knowledge of the potential risks that may be present in that plant in terms of finished product, in terms of ingredients, in terms of potential suppliers, with the goal of asking pretty focused questions and really trying to dig into whether that company they're inspecting gets it. Have they really looked at the potential risks? Because the inspector may be armed with a list of potential risks for this type of given product, and if you haven't thought of all of them, you might get dinged on it. And I say might because I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out. But this is how what we're thinking that companies should be approaching a FSMA-compliant food safety plan. There really is an expectation that this is taken seriously, and the notion of hey, you know, we've got a HACCP plan, we're good, right? And as we've been saying ever since the beginning, is like, no, that's not our view. I think we in the agency and the inspectors believe that you need to do more than that. So I think that answer, Barbara, combined with what I said earlier about telling the story, the narrative, is really how companies are approaching this, or they're starting from scratch. Some are doing that because they don't even have good systems in place, and that's also a totally fine way to go. But most of the companies we work with are not starting from scratch.
Scratch, right. Thank you. Let's go back to Melanie. David mentioned the HARP-C word. So there's been a lot of talk. Is HARP-C really HACCP in disguise? Melanie, how are companies with HACCP plans feeling about their readiness? Do they think they're good to go and they don't have much left to do? And if they are thinking that, should they be?
Really fine question. I think some companies do think that they're good to go with just HACCP alone, but I think that's kind of a faulty presumption, quite frankly. You know, as David mentioned, there is an expectation to document your rationale, document your hazard analysis, document the potential hazards in your facility, and document that you thought about it. So, you know, HACCP in its classic sense, you kind of, you know, can get away with skipping that part, quite frankly. In the food safety plan, you really need to lay out the thought process that you went through and the risk analysis that you went through and the hazard analysis that you went through to get to the hazards that you are actually choosing to control. And that's going to be the expectation. So do you have to throw your HACCP plan out? No, absolutely not. What companies do, you know, need to do and can do is it's a bit of repackaging. It's that going back to that storytelling, that narrative that both David and I have been talking to you about today. And so I think most companies, though, do appreciate that there's more to do. There's another level, there's another leap that we need to take as an industry to go from HACCP to HARP-C, or more pointedly, HACCP to a food safety plan. Because that's really where we need to go from HACCP to satisfying FDA's expectations for that food safety plan, satisfying those expectations that David just described, where the FDA inspectors are getting trained, they're getting educated via curriculum to be more savvy, to be looking for some more, you know, true product-related risk-based food safety risks in your facility, which really involves compliance with the elements of the preventive controls rule. So a lot turns on this repackaging of the HACCP plan to the elements of the preventive controls rule, which lays out the elements of the food safety plan. So what we did at TAG, for example, when clients came to us and said, well, how do I do that? We broke those requirements down of what's required in a food safety plan into easily digestible steps, 12 of them to be exact. So I guess you can call it a 12-step program. So many companies are really either approaching us or other third parties who can help them or doing it themselves. But what companies really should be doing now is tackling a HACCP to HARP-C readiness assessment. Identify your gaps, create a roadmap, if you've got gaps, to create a roadmap of where do you need to go to comply with the food safety requirements by the time the compliance dates come around. I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion, to say, what do I need to do to go from HACCP to HARP-C, or again, probably more specifically, HACCP to food safety plan readiness.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. David, let's come back to you. We've discussed this a little bit on some previous FSMA Fridays, but do you think that companies are planning to do a lot more testing now as part of their getting ready for FSMA?
Yeah, short answer to that one, Barbara, I think is yes. At least more testing. A lot more. Nah, I'm not sure. I think it's going to be very much driven company to company. And let's sort of explore that a little deeper. Is what I mean by that is that there are companies now, more so than ever, are focused on environmental monitoring and concerns. And frankly, I think this is driven as much by some of the recent recalls that we've seen as it is by anything that's FSMA related, with this rash of listeria issues in products that traditionally have not been deemed to be high risk from a listeria perspective, like ice cream. There's a lot of companies that are saying, oh, our program's good enough, are we doing enough testing? So I think environmental monitoring absolutely is ramping up. We're already seeing it. We're seeing companies revisit their programs, look at their testing strategies, consider doing more testing, but frankly, more is not always better. You've got to be looking in the right place with the right mindset with that whole program, but that's a whole other webinar. Ingredient testing, not much I think maybe when companies start to look at supply chain risk, we may see a little uptick in ingredient testing. And finished product testing is all over the map. I think we have worked with and talked to companies that absolutely have decided they're going to ramp up finished product testing. They're going to do a whole lot more because of the perception that they need to do it for FSMA. Our view of that is FSMA doesn't require you to do any finished product testing. It says you may do it, you can do it. It is a way to look at risks, but there's no shoulds do it, there's no gotta do it, at least in the proposed rules, versus companies that are doing absolutely no finished product testing and have no intent to do that. So that one's really all over the map, with some companies definitely doing more, a lot more, and some doing none at all. So I think that's a bit more depth in the answer to that question. But overall, yes, I think FSMA will drive more testing, particularly in the environmental space, as I said. And then if you're one of those companies that wants to do the finished product testing and leverage that as part of your FSMA controls, then there'll be more of that too.
Okay, great, thanks. Melanie, let's come to you for the last of our pre-submitted questions, and then we'll get some questions from the audience. How are companies approaching supply chain risk controls for FSMA compliance?
Barbara, what I've seen companies do specific to the FSMA rules are that companies are focusing on complying with the preventive controls rule requirements for supplier verification and supplier controls. And this is mainly because when the revised rules for foreign supplier verification came out, FDA stated that if you comply with the preventive controls rules requirements, you'll be in compliance with the foreign supplier verification requirements if they apply to you. So the other thing that companies are focusing on is really getting down to the nuts and bolts pragmatic approach of how to build and implement these programs. You know, it's one thing to have a regulation requiring you to build a program and to have a program that looks and feels and has certain components in it. But it's another thing to build it in a way that really works in your unique corporate culture and corporate environment based on your own risk tolerance, those types of factors. You know, not to really dig into the requirements of each of the factors of what needs to be entailed in a supplier program under the preventive controls rule, but what companies really are focusing on when they build this kind of really pragmatic approach is building it based on risk. So that's looking at not just the risk of the supplier, but the risk of the supplier and the inherent risk of the product that it's presenting to you. And also, obviously, with a foundation on science. So it's risk-based, it's science-based, and it's gotta work in your world, in your unique corporate culture, and obviously still needs to meet the requirements of the rules. That said, I'd invite David to provide any additional insights he might have on that as well.
Thanks, Melanie. No, I think you covered it. I think there is. This is going to be another one where we'll have to see if the finals look like the proposed, and I think they will. But I think you've pretty much covered that one.
Great. Okay. Well, then let's get some questions from the audience. I'm going to spend a moment to talk to folks about how Safety Chain can help automate a FSMA-ready food safety plan and help with the documentation and the supply chain controls. You can see I've gone out of full screen. Everybody should be able to now see the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and you can submit your questions there. Just enter them and hit send. And while those are queuing up, let me give you a little bit of information. As most of you know, Safety Chain has food safety automation software that can help a company meet many of the requirements of FSMA, or at least the program and documentation requirements. We can help you put comprehensive supplier compliance and supply chain controls in place, help you with the automation of your HARP-C plans, help you schedule, monitor, validate all plan components, and make sure that every record is time and date stamped, documented, actionable, and accessible at the click of a mouse. We help find nonconformances in real time for you for timely CAPA generation. Again, creating a central repository of all upstream, internal, and downstream documents and data. And for many companies who are using GFSI certification as a way to become FSMA ready, we can also help you automate GFSI program compliance. We've got a paper on our website on how we get you FSMA ready. We invite everybody to download that and to contact us to get more information. Speaking of more information, we see a lot of questions coming in, so let me just put some things up here, and then we'll come back to these questions. As we said earlier, I see a couple of questions on getting the recording that will be sent out by Monday. You can see our schedule coming up. Next month we'll be addressing in-depth building a FSMA-ready food safety plan. And we're expecting the newly announced final rules to be coming out in August. And so for the rest of the year, we're going to be taking those rules one by one. The preventive controls for human and animal food, I guess that's really two. On September 25th, we'll be looking at the produce rule in October, the foreign supplier verification program in November, and then in December we'll be discussing what to expect from FSMA in 2016. We've got some great events coming up that you can register for at safetychain.com. As part of our Tech Talk series, we're going to be talking about HACCP and HARP-C automation on August 6th and how to be audit ready all the time on October 16th. We're launching our 2015 GFSI series with the North American leaders of SQF, BRC, and FSSC 22000 on November 25th. Stay tuned. You'll be receiving info soon. We've also mentioned before the Atchison Group has been taking a lot of the topics that we've covered kind of at that high level here in FSMA Friday and doing some fabulous in-depth training. You can visit their website and their training page for future events and also access to a lot of the past trainings, and you can see both of our website information there for more information. So with that, let's get to some of the questions that we have. Let's see, Kelly is asking, are preventive controls the same as prerequisite programs? I have heard some trainings say yes and some say no. Can you clarify? Let's see, David, do you want to take that one or you want to pass that one to Mel?
Well, I'll take it, and I will give a total Melanie legal answer and say it depends.
Okay. Good job, David.
Oh, thank you, Melanie. No, you're training me well to be an attorney. I'll be a JD before I'm done. Well, maybe not. No, I think that actually is an excellent question, joking apart from Kelly. Frankly, the answer is no. They are not. Prerequisite programs, excuse me, are, as we all know, are the fundamental underpinnings of GMPs, of a robust HACCP system. And the expectation from the regulators, as we interpret it, is that there's going to be some components of your prerequisite programs that will need to elevate to a level of risk-based preventive controls. And the obvious one is environmental cleaning, sanitation, and environmental monitoring programs. Those traditionally are not part of the conventional HACCP plan. They are part of the prerequisite programs. And if you are in a facility where you're making a ready-to-eat product that's going to be exposed post-processing and before packaging and not going to receive further kill steps, then you're going to need to put a program in place to control the risks in that environment, which include the monitoring program. To us, that is a clear escalation of what is a traditional PRP into a HARP-C type bucket. Other components of your prerequisite program, say like maintenance, preventive maintenance, like grounds and environment, like infrastructure, like your pest control program, no. They stay where they are. They stay as part of your prerequisite programs. They continue to be the underpinning of a robust system. I don't think there's any expectation from the FDA to see those elevated up to hazard analysis, risk-based preventive control thinking. So it really does depend, and there is no one-size-fits-all. The expectation is that you will really look at your systems from receiving to shipping, and obviously including supply chain, and ask yourself, where are my risks which could result in a significant hazard? And if I find one, the expectation is that you will control that through a preventive control program. And in some situations that has to be validated, and in some it doesn't. I think more details will emerge on that with the final rules. But for example, in the proposed rule, the agency said the allergen control program does not have to be validated. The environmental monitoring program does not have to be validated. Now that's the regulatory requirement. Our view of it, of those, is yeah, you probably should validate them. You want to know that your cleaning and sanitation program is working. Validate it. The FDA may not require it, but as a best-in-class approach to food safety, then yeah. So complex answer, but it's to what seems like a simple question. But hopefully, Kelly, you understand what I mean by it depends. It really does require a kind of a facility-by-facility sort process.
Great. Thank you, David. Melanie, question from Katie. Will environmental monitoring become mandatory for packing house operations for whole fruit that can be eaten raw?
I may need to engage co-counsel with David here, but it sounds from the question as though that this facility may be governed by the produce safety rule and not the preventive controls rule. And so what we've talked about here today is talking about environmental monitoring requirements as it relates to the preventive controls rule if you're a manufacturer or processor. So if this facility, based upon my limited knowledge on the question, is just processing whole fruit to be consumed raw, not going to a further processor, I'm not so sure that that is a mandatory requirement, but I will defer to co-counsel David to see what his thoughts are.
Anything to add to that, David?
Yeah, well, again, this is a very good question, and I think it gets right at the heart of some of the confusion that's sitting out there with many people in this space, I think including us. There isn't real clarity on this one at this point. I think I think Melanie's got it right that there needs to be a determination whether you are under the produce rule or whether you are under the preventive control rule, because you'll be under one or the other. And that gets driven by whether you're a farm or not, and it's going to be driven by exactly what you're doing in that facility. And there is definitely, I think, situations where that facilities like that, which are independent of a farm, would be deemed to be processing the products if they're washing, sorting, etc. And they may well be required to have an environmental monitoring program. So I think this is a really gray zone right now, and I think it's going to be driven by which it's back to what we said very early on, Barbara. Which rules apply to me? Am I in a produce rule or am I in a preventive control rule? And there is this awful, difficult gray space called mixed type facilities, which I frankly are a nightmare to try to figure out, and hopefully the final rules will clarify that. I would make one other point on this one, though, that we've seen, FSMA aside, we've seen, and others in this space have seen situations that have popped up in facilities like that, which have resulted in listeria present on ready-to-eat fruit, whole fruit, which have resulted in pretty massive recalls. So, frankly, irrespective of whether you need to be FSMA compliant, our recommendation is it's important to look at what you're doing in those types of facilities, because it's not unexpected that some of those processes of the waxing and the cleaning and the brushing and the sorting and all the belts and the washers and the sponges, et cetera, and that are in there for cleaning will become contaminated with listeria. and then they simply become, unless you're cleaning and sanitizing properly, they then become an ongoing source, putting listeria on the fruit. And as we've seen, if FDA happens to test it at retail and they find it, you'll be in a recall situation, no question about that, because of zero tolerance. And so I think FSMA is still a bit gray, but as an industry best practice, absolutely look at it and make sure that you're not heading down into a bad place with what you're doing. But hopefully more clarity when we see the rules.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question, I think, David, we're going to stick with you for this one, from Guyan asking, is there a guide to determine what pathogens need to be tested in different food products, including animal food, in order to comply with FSMA?
No, there isn't. And this gets, I mean, if I'm really taking the spirit of the question of which pathogens to test for, absolutely not. I've seen nothing like that from a guidance document per se, and I don't expect that we will. What I do anticipate is that when the rules are final, we will see guidance documents coming out from FDA, at least I hope we will, that speak to moving it kind of up a layer, is what types of risks should you be taking into consideration in different food types. And I know the FDA broke food types into 20, 25 different types of foods, and a number of groups were involved in developing draft guidance documents for the FDA a few years ago on that, which was really getting at what are the hazards I should be thinking about in the context of different commodities of food. And so I think there's an expectation through those guidance documents is that that's kind of the list of the potential hazards that you need to think about: microbiological, physical, and chemical. And then obviously radiological is now fitting under chemical. But as to the very specific question of guidance on what to test for, no, and I don't think we're ever going to see that.
Okay. Melanie, a question from Teresa. Can you provide any example risk assessments on ingredients, suppliers, to show the difference between a HACCP approach versus a HARPC approach?
I can just give a high-level example of a difference. I mean, certainly there is, the classic 7 steps of HACCP. So HACCP typically requires a TQP. That is very often something that you can measure. It's something that you can take a temperature of. It's something that you can monitor. A HARPC approach is where we need to think, it's a paradigm shift. We need to take the blinders off. It's something that very often may not be something you can take a temperature of. It's something that very often we can't measure. It's something, for example, like employee hygiene. It's hand washing. So if you're making cream-filled donuts, for example, in your facility, employee hygiene such as hand washing becomes very critical to control the risk of Staph aureus. But you can't necessarily measure or take a temperature of or take a very objective metric stat of employee hand washing. You're going to have to do that through observation. Yet it's very critical to the control of that particular hazard in your facility. So that's just an example of moving from a kind of a paradigm shift in thought process from classic HACCP to hazard analysis, risk-based preventive control. Employee hand washing becomes preventive control for a hazard that's a significant hazard in your facility because of the product risk that you have in your facility that presents itself in that Staph aureus risk because you're making that cream-filled donut. Again, turn it over to David. Maybe he's got another example, but that's the one I had on the slide for you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. Yeah, I don't, but I think that's, once again, these are very practical, important questions that I think a lot of companies are asking, and without trying to tag too heavily on this, these are exactly the kinds of robust let's dig in and figure that out with you type strategies that we work with our clients on. And each one is a bit of a case by case, but the example Melanie gave is a great one.
Okay, great. It looks like we have time for maybe just one more question here, and I'll give this. I'll start with you, David, on this one. And for the rest of the questions, we'll hold on to these, and we'll try to get to them next month. But thank you, everybody, for submitting so many great questions. David, will FDA offer an adequacy audit service if a facility wants to validate their preventive control program in the early stages of FSMA? Do you think they'll do that? And if so, how would companies access that?
Well, that's an interesting question. Can you just repeat? Will the FDA offer, what was the description?
Adequacy audit services if a facility wants to validate their preventive control program. I think they're asking, will the FDA come in and help you do an audit, see if you're on the right track before you have to be compliant?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of the gist of the question. That's a really interesting idea, right? In reality, I think there's no way they're going to do that. They don't have the resources to be able to inspect officially all the establishments that they need to get inspected, especially when you look at the international side of it. So I think there's no way they're going to be able to come up with that type of a program to kind of help companies get there. The closest we'll get is guidance documents, maybe some online training opportunities. I think the Preventive Controls Alliance, which is about to, I think, wrap up its work when these preventive control rules come out. I think we will see a bunch of information come out from them, which will, to some extent, help companies get to that point. But I certainly don't see the FDA coming out with the FDA coaching team to get you into the pre-audit, pre-inspection mode. It's just not the way the FDA operates philosophically, and I don't think that's going to change.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, David and Melanie, for another really insightful FSMA Friday, and thanks to everybody for submitting all of your questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. We are about 20 minutes past our due time. So thanks, everybody. We hope that you can join us next month. And everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.